Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to the Virginia countryside near Warrenton on October 12th, 1863. A lone Union cavalryman is speeding away from the front lines on this crisp autumn day. He soon encounters federal provost guards who order him to halt. He does so and relays an urgent request to the men. He and his fellow troopers have come under heavy attack by the enemy and, low on ammunition, they need help immediately. The provost guards doubted the veracity of the harried cavalryman's request. They had heard the same story repeatedly that day, told by stragglers fleeing advancing Confederates. The provost had turned all of these shirkers away, and they were not going to make an exception now. They denied the request and sent the cavalrymen back to the front lines. However, this case was different. The cavalrymen had, in fact, told the truth. Not far away, at a ford along the Rappahannock River, more than 70 of his comrades were fighting for their lives. The men belonged to the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and they were led that day by two lieutenants. One of them is pictured here, First Lieutenant Lester Phelps. He would later note about this forgotten skirmish and a little remembered campaign as one of the most memorable actions in which he had participated during the entire war. In fact, Phelps had been promoted to lieutenant just a few months earlier, coincident with the Battle of Gettysburg. He was a 24-year-old peacetime clerk. He and the rest of his regiment had performed picket duty during the momentous three-day engagement at Gettysburg. After the fight, they pursued General Robert E. Lee's defeated army through Pennsylvania as Phelps and his fellow Keystone State troopers harassed the enemy's flank and rear from Gettysburg all the way to the Potomac River, where Lee and his men ultimately crossed safely into Virginia. The Confederate and Union armies had emerged from the Gettysburg campaign greatly reduced in size due to all of the combat and other losses related to disease and other issues. During the months that followed the campaign, both Lee and Major General George G. Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, had dispatched more troops to the Western Theater. These moves indirectly impacted Lieutenant Phelps and the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Lee, in fact, had to dispatch two of his divisions and Lieutenant General James Longstreet to reinforce General Braxton Bragg's understrength Army of the Tennessee. Bragg had just won a surprise victory against the Union Army of the Cumberland and its commander, Major General William S. Rosecrans, at Chickamauga, Georgia. That was on September 19th and 20th of 1863. Bragg drove the Federals into Tennessee and surrounded them at Chattanooga. With the Union Army trapped in Chattanooga, Meade ordered two of his troops to break the siege, or at least help break the siege. Lee learned that Meade had detached his corps in early October and launched an offensive to take advantage of Meade's weakened forces. The result was a series of mostly small-scale skirmishes in the vicinity of the Rappahannock River as advance elements of the two depleted armies clashed. One skirmish put Phelps and his command in grave peril. That clash, the one I described in the beginning of this video, occurred near Sulphur Springs, also known as Warrenton or Fauquier Springs. Once a popular resort for Washingtonians seeking its beneficial waters, it now lay in ruins. A year earlier, during the Second Bull Run campaign, the Springs main hotel had been burned to the ground. During the afternoon of October 13th, Confederate cavalry advanced towards the Springs. Union forces responded by tearing up a nearby bridge across the Rappahannock to slow the enemy advance. The Federals ordered in a detachment commanded by Phelps and one of his close friends and fellow lieutenants, William A. Daly, to block a ford below the destroyed bridge. They also dispatched an artillery piece and a smaller detachment from the 8th in support. The Pennsylvanians grabbed their sabers, revolvers, and carbine rifles and saddled up. Phelps and Daly took the lead and rode rapidly to the ford. Upon arriving, they dismounted, took up a position in rifle pits on the north side of the river, and waited. Meanwhile, on the south side of the river, Confederate cavalry from Major General JEB Stuart's command pushed up the Rappahannock. The aggressive Stuart reported, quote, I made preparations to force the passage of the river at Warrenton Springs, end quote. Stuart added, quote, our dismounted men were thrown forward, supported by a small force of infantry, end quote. As the rebels advanced against the Yankees, Stuart received additional support from field guns attached to Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's corps. The Confederates approached the ruined bridge at about 5 p.m. on the 13th. Stuart ordered the 12th Virginia Cavalry to charge. Phelps and the Pennsylvanians braced for the onslaught. Stuart wrote, the charge of this little band of the 12th Virginia was worthy of special praise. Charging first up to the piers of the bridge, it was discovered that it had been taken up, thus exposing them to a dangerous fire from the enemy on the opposite side. That, of course, was Phelps, Daly, and their Pennsylvanians. Stuart continued, nothing daunted in purpose, however, they turned about and took the road to the ford below, which they plunged in the face of the enemy's fire without halt or hesitation. Lieutenant Phelps and others blasted away with their carbines until their ammunition ran critically low. Still, the rebels kept on coming. Someone, perhaps Phelps, ordered one of the men to get help. That was the soldier who encountered the provost guards near Warrenton. Meanwhile, Phelps and the men continued to fire until they ran out of shells. They tossed aside the spent carbines and reached for their revolvers. But it was too late. The Confederates cut them off and captured Phelps, Daly, and most of the 70 men in their command. Stuart resumed the advance. He explained, quote, as it was nearly dark, my first care after crossing was to have the bridge relayed so that the infantry might cross directly over. It was but the work of a few moments when the column continued its march to the north side of the Rappahannock, end quote. 2 days later, the only significant infantry action of Lee's offensive occurred due west of Sulphur Springs at Bristow Station. The Confederates suffered a defeat and about 1,900 casualties that it could ill afford to lose. The rebel offensive sputtered to a halt a few weeks later. The series of skirmishes and other actions later came to be known as the Bristow Campaign. Although the campaign resulted in no strategic advantage for either side, it was the last time General Lee launched a large-scale offensive with his army. The officer in overall command of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry, Major Joseph W. Wistar, blamed the provost guard, the one who didn't allow reinforcements to come, for the capture of Phelps and the rest of the command. Quote, they were out of carbine ammunition and the provost marshal refused to allow the messenger to pass to the regiment for more, though provided with a written order stating his business, end quote. That's the comments of Major Wistar. But the provost marshal, the one that refused, his name was Lieutenant Frederick William Heslop. He came back at Wistar and said, quote, no person came to me that day with a pass of any description. If a written pass signed by the proper authority had been presented to me, I should have passed the bearer, end quote. Well, you can imagine that that messenger didn't have time to get a formal pass, considering that Phelps, Daly, and about 70 other men were being attacked by Stuart's troopers. By the time this exchange occurred, Phelps was confined in Libby prison along with Daly and the rest of the captured men. They remained there through the winter and suffered severely from the cool, cold, dank conditions. On February 9th, 1864, Phelps and Daly were part of the 109 Union officers who broke out of Libby prison, which went down in history as the Great Escape. Phelps and Daly numbered among the unlucky escapees who were recaptured and returned to Libby. A few months later, Phelps was sent to Macon, Georgia, and held in Camp Oglethorpe, a prison for officers. They received relatively good treatment, unlike the hellish conditions endured by federal enlisted men sent to nearby Camp Sumter, better known as Andersonville. In late 1864, Union forces led by Major General William T. Sherman on the march to the sea left a path of destruction and desolation through the Georgia heartland and threatened the security of Camp Oglethorpe. Phelps and other captives were hustled off to South Carolina. Phelps would spend the fall in Charleston and Christmas in Columbia. He received a parole and was exchanged in March 1865, bringing his year-and-a-half captivity to an end. Phelps returned to his regiment with a promotion to captain only a few weeks after General Lee surrendered his army to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. That, of course, on April 9th, 1865. One of Phelps's final assignments in uniform was a stint as Provost Marshal of Appomattox County. He's pictured here about this time with his captain's bars on his shoulder straps and an Officer of the Day sash. Phelps mustered out with the survivors of the 8th Cavalry in August 1865, moved to Connecticut, and melted back into society. He settled in Hartford, the suburb of Rockville, secured a clerical position in the county court system, and married in 1868. Over the next 35 years, he worked his way to probate court judge. He died of heart disease in 1910. At age 71, his wife and a daughter survived him. So thanks for listening to the story of Lieutenant Phelps and his encounter with JEB Stuart's troopers on an October day in 1863 at Sulphur Springs. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.